daydreaming about dragons. We're back. I want to talk about something. I want to talk about starting off the game. All right? What's the first thing you say? No one talks about that. Never hear anybody talk about that. So I want to talk about something that I've done, something that I didn't realize I was totally biting off an old friend of mine, which is great. I love doing that. Don't mind stealing techniques and other ways you can use this. So I had a game go the other day. It was a Blades in the Dark investigative game, and the previous game had ended with a vicious act of violence, in which an NPC was shot in the head by another NPC right in front of the players. And they also found out where a lot of this violence was all coming from and who had killed one of the character's friends back in the day. A bunch of things all came to light. It was all about violence. It was all kind of interesting. So the next game, what I did is I talked about how there were servants in the room scrubbing the blood off the floor from where the one character had died, and I went over, as like an introduction, I did like a montage where I went over every act of violence in the game. And it was really fun, and it was kind of interesting. It took 2.5 minutes, right? I just went over all of them that I could remember. And I missed a couple. Going back, I actually missed a couple I wish I'd gone over. But I think that's an interesting way to thematically draw everyone back in, is just to go over something. And even just to like kind of montage list it was neat. I mean, if it was Burning Wheel, my old Sword Lord's Burning Wheel game, we could have gone over every act of sorcery and summoning, or every time a god was contacted, because there were these saints and demigods that were contacted pretty regularly. It was very dangerous and kind of terrifying, but it was done. And there were enough instances of it that I could go through the game and probably remember all of them and kind of do a montage. I think that's an interesting way to do things, rather than just doing, I mean, the montage we all kind of think of is the training montage, right? Where the character is getting better at something, you see them working on it, Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. They worked hard with Miyagi coaching him, and then suddenly, you're at the tournament and you're much better than you were. And you've got to use that training to overcome the challenge. But I think there are other ways to use montages, and it can be a good way to break the ice and get the game moving, and to remember certain things that have happened in the game that you want the characters to remember. Right? And you can pick thematically whatever you want. It can be every time, if you're playing D&D, every time someone's rolled a 20. Can you remember every time that's happened? And if you think, well, I might do this 6 or 7 games from now, you can keep track. You can do every time a really cool spell was cast. Every time a character has grown closer to one another. Every time a character has betrayed one another. It all depends on what game you're playing and what the setting is. And it can be a good way. Sometimes you're not really sure where to start. And that can be a good way to get things going. Just say, I'm going to go over all the, if this is a TV show, the music is playing. And if you want to be super cool, you can even have music playing. Okay, so where did I get this from? I think one of the places I got this from, other than TV and movies, is my buddy Robert Aarons used to do this at our 7th Sea game back in the day. And when we show up to his house, he'd always be playing cool, or to the apartment where we gamed, he'd always be playing cool music. And then he would turn the music off and go into like a short, but punchy monologue, where very often what he would do is he would show things that our characters couldn't see, but would inform the players, which was awesome. So that's another way to montage, is to show reactions all over the world for things that the characters have done. Another cool way to do it. And that's what Robert did, and it was really cool. It was just, I remember thinking, wow, in practice, I feel like if someone described this act to me, I wouldn't like it. But when Robert does it, I love it. And I think it's really neat. It could be a neat way to bring the characters in on how much of an effect they're having on the world. Because you can go over things that are happening and show their effects, show the ripples in the ponds, going out across the entire setting. Cool stuff. Montage scene. That's where we're at today. Introducing the game, getting the game started. Love it. Love it. Very concrete, easy to use. How do you start your games? Do you have a ritual? Do you have a thing? Because I find very often saying, okay, where were we last game? And starting right from where we left off is usually a mistake. For me, when I make mistakes, it's because I want to start too close to where I ended, rather than letting the game breathe and being like, okay, that ended. Where are you now? So that's why I'm thinking about this. Introductions and montages. How do you start your games? Do you use any kind of montage thing? Do you go over things in a way that remind the players of a certain theme or act in the game? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. All right. It's inspiration goat time. Let's get to it. Yeah, I can't believe we haven't talked about this yet, Inspiration Goat. I kinda can't believe it. So we're going to talk about the modern television masterpiece, The Wire, today. And I just want to talk about one tiny aspect of it. I'm not going to go over all 5 seasons. I'm not going to talk about which seasons I like better and why and whatnot. Not doing that. Here's what I think is an interesting thing to take with you from The Wire, and what you can bring with it to your game. Here's the deal. The Wire, to me, one of the aspects of The Wire that I want to talk about today is about how institutions, or if you want to talk about gaming, factions, put pressure on people to be a certain way, to act a certain way, how there's institutional pressure on humans, right? To do certain things. And then you've got characters like Omar Little, who are weaving in between those factions. And in a way, if you're looking at The Wire as D&D, Omar is very much the D&D adventuring group, right? He's the one who doesn't really owe allegiance to any particular factions and is evading one while stealing from another, and often evading them too. So that's something I think is worth thinking about. When you look at an NPC, thinking about what pressures are upon that person. What is the pressure upon that person? Who is putting that pressure on that person? What does that person need to do their job? Who keeps them in that job? Right? And that's an interesting question for the players to start asking. Maybe they can't go after the Lich King directly. Maybe it's too much of a step right now. Or maybe they just don't want to. They don't want the Lich King to know that they exist. But they can go after a morally ambiguous vampire duke who controls most of the Lich King's armies. Suddenly, wait a minute, if the Lich King loses that vampire duke, what happens? What happens to those armies? And I think that's an interesting thing to talk about with The Wire. The Wire does not have Lich Kings, nor does it have vampire dukes, but it does have institutions putting pressure on people. And I think it's a great way for you to break things down as a GM and as a player when you're trying to figure out how to affect the setting and how to go after an antagonist. Is to start to think about what pressures are on this person. Who's putting that pressure on this person? What do they need? What are they looking for? What resources do they need in order to continue? Who do they get that from? Who do they have to? Who is it that could come to them who would force them to compromise? And how do you do that? How do you force them to compromise? Who's their enemies? Sometimes the enemies of your enemies are your friends. And I think if you start mapping that out, both as a GM and as a player, you can come to some really interesting things and find some really interesting plans, rather than just, we're going to knock down the front door of the Lich King and take his stuff. You know, it's also interesting to be like, well, we're going to force the Lich King to surrender because they don't have enough soldiers to perpetrate a war, because they can't, lay siege to the necropolis without the vampire duke's armies. So that is what I'm thinking about. And for some people it makes sense, and some people it doesn't. And maybe they won't know. So maybe they have to go to someone who's a specialist. I'm keeping this thought on a D&D scale, but if you're going after a dragon's horde, who does that dragon trust to watch the horde while they're sleeping? I don't know. Does the red dragon have fire giant friends who worship it like a goddess? Are there tribes of fire giants who worship Tiamat and therefore are trusted with dragons when they're sleeping? I don't know. I don't know, but I think it's interesting. Who do these people trust? What institutions are putting pressure on them? Cool questions to ask for your setting as you're mapping things out. And it doesn't have to all be mapped out. You can definitely look at Blades in the Dark for a good way to map out factions and how they do it. And the way that they have certain key people in the organization, usually around 2 or 3 named, and then the way that Blades in the Dark does it is they have to show that each faction is in motion, and to show that each faction is going towards a goal, they have clocks that the factions are working towards, right? So the Bluecoats are working towards getting military surplus gear for their city watchmen and cops. That's what they're working towards. So if a gang, so very often in the Blaze in the Dark gangs that I have, when a gang does something and it turns out really violent and it's terrible, very often the City Watch commander will go, in front of the newspapers and say, if we had military gear, these kinds of scoundrels would not be able to get away with this. And that's why I am putting forward to the city council that we should have war hulls and zeppelins and state-of-the-art rifles rather than just cudgels and near ancient pistols that barely work. So the way that works is, the cool thing about having factions in motion is they're moving towards something all on their own. And you as the players can start to affect that. Oh, this is what they want. This is what they're moving towards. We can offer them help on that. And then we can be allies. Rather than having to map everything out to how someone maps to someone else. You can just give each faction a goal that they're moving towards, and then, boom, you've got their direction. And then they'll just ping off each other like mad. Because, keep it simple, let the players make it complicated, right? It's an old thing I've said. Cool. This is all from The Wire. So that's what I'm thinking about today. The Wire and institutional pressure. And if you've got ways that you deal with factions in your games, I would love to hear about it. And we'll have more intro on how to contact me in the outro. Thanks. If you would like to support this show, Daydreaming About Dragons, there are a few ways to go about it. You can hit the support this show button and offer money once a month or however much you can. That's lovely. I have some money saved up from supporters, and I'm going to be looking around at Patreons to support so I can talk about what folks are making and use that to support the show more. And support the Inspiration Goat, who is hungry. So that's one way. You can also purchase my book, Dictionary of Moo. There will be a link to it in the show notes. You can also send me a message, send me an email at judd.karlman@gmail.com. Send me a tweet. There'll be a link to my Twitter account in the show notes. However you want, you can also go on the Anchor app and send me a 1-minute MP3. You can string a couple of 1-minute MP3s together. You can email me an MP3, which was done recently, and I will put it on the midweek reply show. If you do that, please let me know what's going on at your gaming table. Is there something that I talked about that inspired you to remember a technique that you used that's been successful or unsuccessful or challenging, whatever's going on? I'd love to hear from you. And I hope your summer is going splendidly. It's con season. If you're going to cons, I hope you're having fun. I hope you're taking your vitamins so you don't come up with con crud when you get back home. If you're not going to cons, I hope things are going well on the home front. And I will see you in the middle of the week because we got a lot of good midweek reply stuff. So we're going to have a couple weeks of good midweek reply shows. Okay? I'll see you next time. No inspiration goats were harmed in the recording of this podcast. Inspiration goat is used with the permission of Janaki Parthasarathi.